Grandmama used to pray, oh Lord, please save them from the evil snares and all the dangers that entangle. Yea, though they walking through the valley of the shadows, just prepare and make them fit for every battle, because I know they bound to come, and I know they bound to fall, but in your bounty, Lord, preserve their beautiful. Right, we still surviving off of grandma's prayers, surrounded by the jungle and the lion's den. Tread light, cause these traps is inconspicuous. They hiding right in plain sight, thinking we don't see them when they linger. Look right beneath the surface, then leave a trail of corpses. Crisis, prices, your life a disposable commodity. Like living in this fantasy, conditioned to believe that the system even cares whether selling CDs or walking or driving or reading. Look, they don't even need a reason. It's just you breathing and being black. When it's such a pretty fall, it don't seem like we falling at all, at all. It's just a GMO dream, where things are never really what they seem. Please cue the violins, tell them just to play me something pretty, cause this gritty city got me screaming bloody murder. Said it got me screaming. This gritty city got me on some. Look, get your hand up on my pocket. Distraction, so lazy they use the same tactics. Like condom with some trinkets, just don't let them get to thinking. That light bulb gets a blinking. You know niggas and ideas. Oh dear, my dear, you may not know me, but I know you very well. Foresight, they say hindsight is 2020. Well, tell me something, we gotta see that history is on repeat. And maybe it takes a beat and a melody to speak a little louder than the message in the clouds or the essence in the air. I swear, my God is just so clear that a system driven by fear can never give us nothing but more of the same things. Oh, when it's such a pretty fall, it don't seem like we falling at all. It's just a GMO dream, where things are never really what they seem. Please cue the violins, tell them just to play me something pretty, cause this gritty city got me screaming. It's murder. Got me screaming, got me. This gritty city got me on some.
What's happening, good people? This is RSTV, Black Power Media. We are in the building today. Again, we got a whole lot going on, whole lot coming up in the following week, in the following weeks. We're going to be bringing you that critical political action. For folks who didn't catch us this morning, we had Chuck D from the revolutionary hip-hop group Public Enemy on deck. Make sure you go back and check that episode, see what we talked about earlier. Upcoming episodes, we have, I'm not even going to tell you all the people we got coming up. Just know that a few things is happening. We're going to have some, I know that November is going to be Hip Hop History Month. So what I decided to do with that was bring in a number of different revolutionary artists, cultural workers. So you have some heavy duty surprises for that. Chuck D kicked it off, even though Hip Hop History Month begins in 2 days. We said we was going to get it started to let you know we wasn't playing. We said, let's start with Public Enemy. If you are new to the platform, on the artist tip, we've had everyone from the Last Poets to the Watts Prophets to members of Wu-Tang Clan to members of Arrested Development and so many other artists who've come through. That's the plug on the artist tip. Also, when we talk about politics, on Mondays, as you know, we do RSTV from 8 to 10 a.m. But also, I want to bring back something that we started a while back, Freedom Fridays. So on Fridays, you can catch a glimpse of some situations mainly revolving around political prisoners, because we know that political prisoners is, that's the order of the day. If we're not fighting for our troops, then why fight? Because at any given moment, we all can become political prisoners, right? So with that in mind, we know that over the past several months, we've suffered a couple different losses in regards to political prisoners. We've lost Dr. Mutulu Shakur back in late July, and most recently Ruchell Magee. And Ruchell Magee, we know, just from this platform and wherever else you check out, that we've been pushing his case and his plight for a while. He was locked up for over 67 years, and he was all but forgotten. Of course, we've criticized different folks on this platform because we felt that the push for Ruchell wasn't in the manner that it should have been. So to a great extent, some of us, we feel that, we failed the brother. But nevertheless, he was released, compassionate release, a few months ago. Um, and today we wanted to commemorate him. And I didn't want to go the regular old route and bring on folks who read about him or folks who might have knew him in 1970 for a brief moment in time, and forgot about him as their careers grew. I wanted to bring on one of his attorneys, and also wanted to bring on a longtime freedom fighter and a former political prisoner himself. So, without further ado, I want to introduce our audience to uh, Mark Kleiman. How you doing, Mark?
Good to see you, Kalonji.
Good to see you as well. How you feeling today?
Okay.
Right,
Glad to be here.
Right. Glad to see you. Glad to see you. We also brought on another cohort, Freedom Archives. Claude Marks, how you doing, Claude? How's everything feeling? How's everything
Hey,
going?
Kalonji, how are you?
Man, we trying to make a revolution out of 15 cents. Think we'll get there?
Well, we're going to try it.
Without a doubt. Now, for folks who aren't familiar with you all, first of all, welcome to RSTV. Welcome to Black Power Media. I don't know if this is your first time coming on the platform, Claude, in regards to Black Power Media, or
I think so, actually. So
okay.
thank you for having me.
Well, we welcome you here. Mark, he ended up on the platform on a clip. Ran into him at Dr. Mutulu Shakur's memorial in Atlanta, so we got a few words from him and a couple other attorneys on that case, on Mutulu's case. And while we were there, I was brought to my understanding that he was also handling Ruchell as well. So definitely glad to have both of you long-term fighters on board. For folks who aren't familiar, and I kind of gave them a brief, very brief. I want to start with you, Mark, and I want to ask for the audience, give us a background on who you are and some of the cases you dealt with in regards to um, liberation cases.
Certainly. Thank you. Well, I got involved in the political struggle in the early 1960s. I'm 73, and I got kicked out of high school for my political activism and went to work at that point for a series of radical and revolutionary organizations. And one of the things I learned quickly was that although courtrooms are where movements go to die, the activists, the organizers, the fighters are really dependent on the close air support and protection and the interference that lawyers can run. So as I matured or aged, I became more interested in trying to use the law politically in that sense. I've represented professors who've been sued for standing up for and speaking up on behalf of the rights of the Palestinian people. I've represented, activists and organizers who've been sued for challenging, developments and political corruption in their areas. I've counseled some of the elders of the American Indian movement locally on some of the struggles they've been having. And it was a natural transition for me to begin working, I should say it's long overdue, on the struggle to free our brothers in arms who have paid such a terrible price of repression here. So I've primarily been working in one limited area, and that's what's called the area of compassionate release, trying to get people out back in their communities so they can interact with their friends and comrades and have time with their family, and have something of a life and not die in the hands of the state. Surrounded by the same cold and oppressive system that has taken so much of their lives already.
Well, we definitely appreciate your work around the whole compassionate release situation, and just your legacy of struggle. And we're glad that you got kicked out of school. If that got you on the right side of the barricades,
It did.
you know, Dead Prez has a song called "They Schools Can't Teach Us Shit." So I guess you adopted that before the track came out. But definitely glad to have you on, Claude. We know that you've been doing serious work with Freedom Archives. If you don't mind giving us a background, and we know you don't like to talk about yourself. We talked about that in the past, so don't make me dig in the crates. But but give us some background on who you are, and your struggles as a political prisoner turned, um, you know, not really turn, but continuing to fight for other brothers and sisters who have been held captive.
Maybe the place to start for me would be, I didn't get kicked out of high school, but I did drop out of UC Berkeley during the Third World Strike back in '69. And I found myself in a situation where because I was participating in the strike as an immigrant from Argentina, I thought my time would be used more valuably by not just simply being on the picket line every day, but I went down to the local educational radio station and asked them why they weren't giving enough coverage to what was happening at Cal. And it turned out they only had one field reporter who was concentrating on the Third World Strike and the Black Liberation Strike at San Francisco State. So I found myself in a situation where I started covering what was going on and became, through a serendipitous trek to the radio station, became a street reporter for KPFA radio. And that launched a whole other part of my life. And of course, I ended up dropping out of UC Berkeley as a result, because I found it far more valuable. It put me into contact with a lot of struggles, certainly the Black Panther Party locally, the occupation of Alcatraz, a lot of other radical movements, Puerto Rican independence movement, the Chicano-Americano struggle. And, over time, I found myself doing media on a regular basis. And at one point in my life, I thought I would chill with the media work and actually, rather than covering what was happening in the prisons and what was happening in the streets, to really engage more fully in the struggle. And over time, I was doing both mass organizing and later on doing clandestine work. And in the course of that, I found myself ultimately in the grips of the state for a period of time as a political prisoner. So this wasn't a particularly new issue for me, because I've been interviewing political prisoners. And there I was experiencing it, not as long as somebody like a Ruchell Magee. That's pretty hard to beat. But I found myself doing that. But the body of work that had been created, not just by myself personally, but by collaboration of various collectives, had been kept intact and was marginalized and not seen. The Pacifica Foundation didn't find it important enough to archive the production of what was essentially third world people doing radio. So we hung on to that. And when I surfaced and ended up in prison, and once I started re-networking with people that I had worked with, the idea started to gel that we had this stuff, it was intact. We had to repurpose it because of its significance, because of its value. So that body of stuff became the initial core of what was to become the Freedom Archives after I got out of prison. And in the course of time, we've not only gathered more material, but we've started to produce and, repurpose a lot of that historical material that had to do with these revolutionary struggles, both internally and externally. So as part of an anti-imperialist framework, as part of an anti-racist framework, as part of a framework that sought to legitimize militant, if not armed struggle, we found ourselves in a unique position and continue to carry that tradition forward to this day. So actually next year, the Freedom Archives will be 25 years old.
Okay. It's funny. I actually thought it was older than that because I feel like, with the number, with so much material that you all have produced and introduced to the world, I definitely salute you all because I think that what you all have done is what we've aspired to do here at Black Power Media. We're only 2.5 years or so in, and our whole purpose and mission has been to do just what you said, legitimize not only armed struggle but resistance as a whole, and to highlight some of the individuals and organizations that have worked and that weren't palatable or accepted by the state. Because oftentimes we only get, what seems to be safe for the moment. This one is, I don't know. I'm easy to offend folks, so I'm just going to stop right there. But anyway, but I want to, because you said something interesting before I go back to Mark. You said that you were behind the microphone and you went from, as Fanon would point out, the grandiose floodlights, you know what I mean, to being an actor. I wouldn't say a privileged actor. You was actively involved in liberation. What prompted that transition? Because I interviewed Mumia a while back, and one of the things I asked him was about the role of the journalist. You know what I mean? And of course, we know his work. We'll have to get into that. But I'm curious because sometimes folks get it confused and they think that, oh, I'm just a journalist, or I'm just a rapper, or I'm just anything, whatever, a puppet, or whatever the case is. Either you for or against this system of oppression. So what prompted you to make that transition or that transformation?
I felt like I had reached certain goals that I felt I could achieve by doing radio work, but there was something inside me that felt far more strongly about, and I'm not, I'm not trying to diminish the importance of journalism. I mean, we can see today, for example, the bravery of journalism in a place like Gaza is essential in speaking the truth of the Palestinians in a time when the global corporate media is essentially trying to silence it and participate in the genocide. So the role of radical journalism is really critical. But for myself personally, I felt much more compelled to participate directly and felt that there was a need to rebuild clandestine capacity in the wake of a number of things that were going on. Certainly not in an isolated sense. We were functioning in conjunction with Black liberation and the Puerto Ricans in particular. And the idea that a movement has to have a mass component, but also a capacity to function outside the purview of the state was something that I felt and believe in, and wanted to essentially commit myself to that aspect of struggle. Of course, there was an aspect of that was righteous, and unfortunately we weren't on the verge of succeeding, which for some period of time a lot of us felt like we could, in really changing who held power in this country. That's still an important goal, and we're not going to get there through an electoral process. But for now, I'm certainly not saying this is the time to hit it in the way that we felt like we were trying to do. But I'm still convinced that ultimately and in the long run, the state will not reach a moral epiphany and give up power willingly. And so when we think about what transforming the world looks like, we have to take, not just for ourselves personally, but more generally, accept the fact that when you're up against the wall, you have to do something more. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that in Palestine right now. The idea that that national liberation is terrorism is really something that is promoted by the Zionists. It's promoted by the U.S. government. It's promoted widely by those who have a stake in empire and don't want to give up the power, even though they've achieved it through means of violence, through genocide, through slavery, through stealing land and stuff. So to me, I felt that seriously enough to commit myself to it. And so for a period of time, that's what I did.
Right. So it's funny because, not funny, but you talked about the people who promoted it, who promoted resistance as terrorism. And it's actually the terrorists themselves that promotes it as terrorism. So it's like, we can crush you, we can steal your land, we can invade, we can commit genocide. But if you decide to fight back, then, either these other formations, organizations, and nations have to denounce you, or they won't eat either. So it's just amazing how this thing works. Mark, I want to ask you, because you mentioned compassionate release, and compassionate release has been a word that's been thrown around for the past several years. We had, I believe, Marilyn Buck had a compassionate release. I believe Russell Maroon Schultz Schultz the second had a compassionate release, and we've Dr. Mutulu Shakur, which you were involved in, Ruchell Magee, so on and so forth. So if you could explain what compassionate release is, and also how did you get involved in working with or on behalf of Dr. Mutulu Shakur and ultimately Ruchell Magee?
Sure. Let me take a step back for a second and sort of set the ideologic framework around compassionate release and the debate about it, because of all of the reformist, sort of escape valve projects to release pressure on the system. This is perhaps one of the most extreme of them, because it does nothing to challenge directly the system of oppression that is created, that the incarceration project is so central to. At the same time, I think we have an absolute moral obligation to our fighters, to the people who have taken risks, to the people who have been willing to step forward and upturn their whole lives in an effort to bring about the change we're all talking about. And, yes, it's reformist, but it's a reform I think we have to, we have to learn to work with. One of my clients actually said, yeah, it's like getting a plate of, if you'll excuse me, the word dog shit with mustard on it. It's still dog shit, but if I've got the mustard.
Right.
I had been meeting with some folks in the People's Law Office in Chicago about a case involving Palestinians who were here in the United States and were encountering political and some potentially very serious legal problems. The People's Law Office in Chicago had gotten its start investigating and exposing the assassination of Fred Hampton. Back in the day, and had gone on to represent a number of revolutionary political leaders. At the time, they were involved on behalf of Dr. Shakur, who was in federal prison in Southern California. And he had a parole hearing coming up, and because he had been in prison so long that the old law that governed old federal prisoners who had been in the system before 1987 still governed him. So he was entitled to a parole hearing. The parole hearings for revolutionaries are always sensitive and painful events, A, because of the utter hypocrisy of the whole thing, but B, because what the parole boards want to hear is somebody recant the way Galileo had to recant during the Inquisition, lest he be burned at the stake. They want someone to say, I was wrong. There's never any justification for violence, etc. They want which ironically has nothing to do with parole. Parole is, what do you like now? What is going to happen in your life when you're back on the streets, etc. And in Dr. Shakur's case, of course, we were talking about a gentleman in his 70s who was already very, very ill. But trying to thread that needle of saying some of the things that the parole boards insist on, while at the same time maintaining your own integrity and revolutionary self-respect, it's a really delicate process. I'm in Southern California. The People's Law Office is in Chicago. They asked me if I would meet with Dr. Shakur. I, of course, agreed to work on this jointly with them. And right while I was setting that up, he got diagnosed with a form of cancer called multiple myeloma. Now, our investigations later proved that he had had these symptoms for at least 2.5 years and possibly as long as 4 years, that nobody had ever taken the trouble to diagnose him. Even one of the prison doctors said, I think this guy needs an MRI. Nothing happened, which is, of course, delayed the treatment. And in the middle of both of these things going on, the potential parole hearing and this diagnosis, we had a change in the federal law. There's been a compassionate release law on the books for years. It has been as hypocritical as calling the colonization of the people in the District of Columbia something done under the Home Rule Act. That's literally what they call the law in D.C. That maintains the entire city as the last plantation in the United States. What Congress did was take the decisions about compassionate release, at least partly, out of the hands of the Bureau of Prisons, which is, of course, a creature of the U.S. Department of Justice. And it gave us on the right, on behalf of people like Dr. Shakur, and it gave all prisoners the right to ask the Bureau of Prisons for compassionate release. And if they did not, if they said no, or if they simply sat on the request, which was typically what would happen, most people died while the request was being considered. If they simply said, we had a right to go to court directly and get the judge involved directly. The federal statute makes it clear that one of the things, but only one of the things, to be weighed in this is the seriousness of whatever crime had been used as a pretext to jail our revolutionary brothers and sisters in the first place. But it's only one of the factors. The others are what's somebody's history been like in prison? How ill are they? What are they? Do they really pose any sort of actual threat when they get out? And in Dr. Shakur's case, we could see what the Bureau of Prisons playbook was going to look like to deny this, because it was exactly the playbook that the Parole Commission had been using. First, they said, let's pretend he's a dangerous and violent person. Now, there's actually an algorithm that the Rand Corporation put together, studying the release histories of something like 60 or 70,000 people who had been in the system federally, and reviewing their prison history to try to predict who's going to be a threat when they get out, who's not going to be a threat. And of course, all those factors are terribly biased to begin with, and there's racism built into them at their core. But even with that built in at the core, on a scale of 1 to 100, Dr. Shakur's score was minus 14. Because he had been such a positive influence on so many of the brothers and the other people incarcerated along with him in this setting. So since they couldn't effectively argue that he was going, and he was too ill to even for them to credibly claim he was going to be a threat. So they tried to claim, well, he could inspire others to be a threat. Dr. Shakur used to sign some of his letters and emails stiff resistance. They said, oh, well, you see, it's the R word, the same word that's being thrown around by the Israeli Defense Force now. If you have resistance, that means you're a terrorist. So just the phrase stiff resistance was used. As we worked to get past that, the next excuse was, well, he's a serious rule violator in prison. He actually spoke to an undergraduate class because he made a call to a professor he was authorized to speak to. And she was in class, and she held her phone up to the mic, and he was able to address a class that had just watched the movie Look Back in Anger, and actually had Danny Glover in the classroom with him. So it is one excuse after another. We were nonetheless able to push through some of this, but what really made the difference was not just the legal arguments around compassionate release, and I could get in the weeds on that if anybody needs to be put to sleep. But what really worked effectively was the legal arguments in tandem with the incredible political campaign that Dr. Shakur's defense committee put together, because that campaign included letters from academicians. It included a letter signed by over 200 ecumenical religious leaders of all faiths. We had several members of Congress who were telling the then Biden Justice Department that they really didn't think this was being handled well. So it was both of these efforts that made the difference. Without the political pressure, I don't think the courts would ever have gone along with this. You can see, by the way, the Justice Department, even in the compassionate release motions, was bringing in the statements from the family members of people who had been the victims of a 40-year-old crime that Dr. Shakur was accused of having masterminded, even though he was never there. There was never any evidence that he was there, etc. Because the federal prosecutors wanted to relitigate what had happened in 1981 as though it was still 1981. Wow. So that was the short version of this. I'm sorry I went on.
No, it's all good. One thing you mentioned before I go back to Claude. You said that, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that the institution, the prison, actually knew that Dr. Shakur had symptoms before he was actually diagnosed. Now, we're finding in many cases with the whole compassionate release situation. I know that Ruchell was out maybe like 2 months after after his release. We know that Dr. Mutulu Shakur, I think it was like 7 months or something like that. Marilyn Buck might have been a couple days. Ruchell Magee not Ruchell Magee. Russell Schultz was a few months. Do you think that part of this process, since it is now a federal law, do you feel that part of it is an attempted assassination? Because what you're saying, it seems like you get tied up in a whole bunch of red tape and nonsense, and they pull every stop out the book. Do you feel that this is an attempt to pretty much get rid of them before they get out, or how do you?
Absolutely. At Dr. Shakur's last parole hearing, at the end of the hearing, the hearing officer from the Justice Department said to him point blank, "You don't have a right to die with dignity." It was that disgusting. When Brad Thompson, my brilliant and just absolutely fearless co-counsel in getting him out. Brad's with the People's Law Office and has worked very successfully to get the moved defendants out as well. Told us all that because Brad was at the hearing. Our heads were ready to explode. Similarly, in Ruchell's case, there was a definite effort by our supposedly not even liberal, progressive California Attorney General, Rob Bonta, to keep Ruchell Magee in prison and to allege that in his horrible condition, he was nonetheless, again, going to be able to inspire these unnamed people to acts of violence. They wanted him to die. They want these people. They want our people to die there, and they systematically deny medical care. It is a deliberate program to do that. The only point I would make, well, there are 2 points I would make briefly. One is that the denial of medical care is universally used to degrade the lives of all prisoners and not just political prisoners. Anybody who is incarcerated experiences this. The other thing is that, and this may be California specific, we have seen in the California Department of Corrections some physicians who rather amazingly have gotten into the prisons and are working with prisoners out of a genuine desire to treat them like human beings and make their lives better and to treat them appropriately. And the difficulty they have is that they're in a system where they're swimming upstream every day. Briefly with Dr. Shakur, the doctor who had seen him and had noticed symptoms several years before writes in his chart he should have the following tests. And after he's had a bit of treatment, not treatment for cancer, but treatment for anemia, blood weakness. And if they don't work, he should get an MRI. Treatment happened. Lab tests showed it didn't work. MRI never happened for years.
Wow.
So even where you have doctors who are humane, the system shackles them as well as their patients.
I appreciate you laying it out, because I think that one of the things we forget about is the whole medical apartheid. We forget about situations like brother from the Black August Organizing Committee, excuse me, from one of the reasons we commemorate Black August, Tari Golden, who was denied medical treatment when he was in a accident on the yard when he bust his head, and how they dealt with him. Claude, and again, we appreciate you. For folks who are new on the block, of course, I think that the three of us would have thought the name Ruchell Magee would be just as popular as his former co-defendants, Jonathan Jackson, Angela Davis, etc. We would think that that name would ring bells just like any other. For folks who are not familiar with Ruchell Magee, can you please give us a breakdown of who this individual is and why we are here today to commemorate and make sure that his name is known?
Well, Ruchell Magee was notably prosecuted, as you mentioned, because of an August 7th, 1970 Marin Courthouse rebellion. That fairly complicated and involved history. You could find a whole commemoration of that on the Freedom Archive's website, including a lot of media, if you want to dig into it. I'll do more of a short version of it, which was there was a takeover of the courtroom during the Soledad brothers case. The Soledad brothers were Fleta Drumgo, George Jackson, and John Clouchet. And they were being tried because of an incident at Soledad Prison in California, in which the violence of the staff against Black prisoners resulted in a level of retribution. Those three were accused of killing guards. Ultimately, they were exonerated, although posthumously in the case of George Jackson, who was assassinated in August 21st, 1971. But the courtroom takeover itself was George Jackson's younger brother, Jonathan, who took over the courtroom with weapons, with the idea that hostages would be taken and that they could essentially use that as a basis of getting on radio and talking about the Soledad brothers case and possibly negotiating the release of prisoners, particularly George Jackson. The response of the state was pretty typical. They basically opened fire on both the hostage takers and the hostages. People died. So you ended up with Jonathan Jackson being killed. William Christmas was killed. Ruchell was a survivor of that incident, was shot, and ultimately tried along with Angela Davis for the rebellion itself at the Marin County Courthouse. Of course, Ruchell is somebody who was busted for the first time in 1955 for allegedly attempting a rape of a white woman. Mind you, this is 1955. This is the same year that Emmett Till is lynched. And the way that so-called justice was being meted out in the South was pretty consistent and in keeping with the, white supremacist system and the Jim Crow laws, was something that impacted on him, so that as a 15-year-old, he was imprisoned as an adult in Angola prison, got out, spent about 4 months on the street in LA, and was basically busted on some minor marijuana charge and an incident regarding that, and was never to see the light of day again until end of July of this year. It's ironic that compassionate release was the basis of his getting out. I mean, what's compassionate about 67 years in prison? I mean, seriously. But he had been to the parole board numerous times. And as Mark had mentioned, the way that you successfully parole is to basically accept the terms of your imprisonment and apologize. Whereas in Ruchell's case, his position was that as a modern day slave, he had a right to rebel. So when the opportunity presented itself August 7, 1970, he was in his right to challenge an unjust imprisonment for a good part of his adult life, and had a right to rebel and attempt to escape prison, just as any slave would rationally try to escape confinement as a slave. What's significant about this is that, to his dying day, he was trying to vindicate himself rather than accept the terms of parole, which is why parole failed in his case. Despite that, he did apply to get released with a lot of encouragement from a progressive and humane medical staff who didn't want to see him die behind bars. But as an act of political struggle for Ruchell Magee, he really set the terms in the modern era for the argument that prison today for oppressed people, for Black and brown people, prison itself is a form of slavery, and therefore the terms of imprisonment need to be challenged. And it's on the basis of that we see the development and the evolution of a whole abolitionist prison movement. And in doing that, he spoke not only for himself as a political prisoner, as a conscious prisoner, but really spoke on behalf of all of the elders that are being held that, have been doing decades and decades behind bars because of the purpose of imprisonment in the first place. And the interpretation of the issue of slavery has really transformed the political basis by which we currently struggle for releases, for challenging the laws that keep people in, for the heinous type of sentences that are being carried out precisely because the role of prisons has to do with preventing rebellion and resistance, whether it's done consciously or not. We see, historically in the history of the United States, where urban rebellions take place, Whether or not they're conducted by entirely conscious people or not is irrelevant to understanding the conditions that trigger the resistance and its righteousness. And so Ruchell really represents the imprisoned version of the same, of people who are committed to a fight for their own liberation, not just as individuals, but collectively. And to that, we have to give him the level of recognition that he deserves. As you mentioned, so many people may or may not study the history of imprisonment in the United States. It's challenging sometimes to come across who Ruchell is in that history of struggle. And it's important for us to make sure that not only can he rightfully continue to claim that role, but that we recognize him for it and pay him the respects that he deserves for having committed his entire adult life to the process of challenging mass imprisonment in the United States.
You know, I want to, and I appreciate that. And I want to remind the audience, because I think that Ruchell was 84 when he transitioned, correct?
Yes.
So here's a man, 84 years old, who, for all practical purposes, was on the street literally 16 and a half years of his life.
Right.
Of 84 years, 16 and a half years, if my math is correct, or close to it, right? That is insane on so many levels. But one of the things I wanted to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Claude, when we talk about the case of Ruchell Magee, the average person assumes that he was in prison because of the August 7th, 1970 Marin County incident. And that's not the case. In fact, he was acquitted by a jury 11-1, if I'm not mistaken. Can you speak to that, Claude?
Well, yeah, I mean, let's keep in mind that he had as you mentioned, he had 4 months in the street in Los Angeles between his bust in Louisiana as a 15-year-old and the latter part of his adulthood. And he was charged with a number of things for the Marin Courthouse Rebellion: murder, for which he was exonerated. I believe the highest level of kidnapping, he was also exonerated. And then there was a hung jury by 11-1 on a lesser kidnapping charge. And yet that was the basis of them holding him for the good part of the rest of his life since 1970 until 2023. So apart from all the legality of it, as you mentioned, the type of vengeance that the system has is highly politicized, and they weren't trying to let him go for all the reasons that they kept him in the first place. So the struggle, even around compassionate release, as Mark mentioned, was being challenged in the courts. The change in the law as of January 2023 in California opened up the potential for the compassionate release to take place in and of itself. And Mark can speak to the legality of it, but we were convinced, and Ruchell was convinced, to utilize that as a way to free himself, knowing that his health wasn't going to give him a lot of time, and that he wanted to die outside of prison and enjoy whatever liberty he could in the remaining part of his life. And I think it's extremely fortunate that a number of people stepped up, knowing who he was, to try to make that possible. And even the transition out, of course, was extremely challenging when you think about just the strangeness of being outside the cell after 67 years. I mean, it was profound. But, you know, Ruchell Magee totally lit up whenever a young kid came in the room. I mean, his family, his cousin, and that whole crew, you know, which included a lot of kids, gave him such joy when he was finally able, you know, to sit in the living room and ask for a cheeseburger or whatever, and see these kids come in and start teasing and kidding and laughing. I mean, that was a beautiful sight, you know. And to me, it really represented that, irrespective of what they did to him, he retained a profound sense of humanity through all this. Not just in the sense of being in the fight, but who he actually was and what brought him joy. It was important to see that they hadn't taken that away from him. They robbed him of a lot of years, but they never robbed him of his fundamental humanity and his commitment to struggle for liberation.
Right on, right on. Mark, and I talked to you maybe about a week ago. And first of all, for the audience, we had planned on getting these two gentlemen on maybe a couple months ago, if I'm not mistaken. And we wanted to get Michelle on as well, but due to the state's antics and tactics and all of that, we weren't able to do that. But I appreciate you all for making that effort. But Mark, I know I spoke to you maybe like last week, and one of the things you know, to piggyback off of what Claude was just saying, I know that you all were able to greet him when he was released, if I'm not mistaken. What was that like? And give us an idea of, as Claude was talking about, this man who was locked up, who was literally incarcerated, and like I said, almost forgotten for 67 years. I mean, it's like he was left in the gulags. I know that, you know, we know that folks who study, we know that he had co-defendants like Angela Davis, and you know, I believe their cases were severed so that they had different lawyers, and their lawyer teams wanted to separate their cases or whatever. I can't speak to what happened after that, but for now, what is you know, what was it like to be in the company of Rochelle and I would say Dr. Mutulu as well, because I know that they both were clients of yours.
Yeah. The word that comes to mind is bittersweet. It's so sweet to see these men who've given so much for all of us out and able to take a breath freely and able to move freely. And at the same time, it's so bitter that it has happened this late in their lives, and that it has happened now when they're in their 70s or 80s, as opposed to 30 or 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, or in Rochelle's case, 60 some years ago. It's too little, too late, but it's the mustard on that plate, as one of my clients said, and we'll take it. You know, the finest part for Dr. Shakur was because he had been pushed out of the federal prison in a wheelchair and loaded into a vehicle and brought to an airport, was watching him get up out of the chair and using the handrails on the plane actually walk up those steps himself. I got to see him at BLM meetings in Los Angeles, got to see him addressing several hundred students at UCLA, a little after Claude's time there. And it was just so important for him to see him in the community, and for the young people in the community to see that their fighters are not being forgotten and their elders are being regarded, and that this continues and will always get picked up.
Hey man, I definitely appreciate your brothers coming on. any words of wisdom or anything you want to leave some of these younger comrades and some of these folks who are thinking that that the revolution came and gone? Is there anything that you all would suggest or give them? Maybe start with Claude.
Well, there's a couple of things that I would suggest, and I'm not just beating our own drum here. We did on our website, which is freedomarchives.org, you can find a couple of things. The first thing to look for is called 99 Books, which is a tribute after 50 years to George Jackson in the face of his assassination in 1971. That includes a tremendous amount of media material, as well as the voice of George Jackson. And ancillary to that is also a 50-year tribute to the Marin Courthouse Rebellion, in which you can hear the words of Ruchell Magee. Don't just believe us, check this stuff out. I think everybody, it's challenging to find alternative forms of history, but I think we put together some pretty good resources that would allow you to dig more deeply into this, as well as curricula if you care to teach it. And so, again, you can find that at the Freedom Archives website.
Definitely a jewel. We appreciate Freedom Archives. It definitely, I've used it over the years, political education classes, so on and so forth. So just to hop on with you is an honor. So I appreciate what you've done throughout the years and continue to do. How about you, Mark? I know that, and one of the things, Mark, that I appreciate that you said as well is in regards to compassionate release, because I think that we have some organizers who look at compassionate release as a victory. And to your point, while we are absolutely grateful that our captives can be set free, that they can come up out of those gulags and not be buried in those hellholes, we still, as Nkrumah would talk about, we claim no easy victories. So again, while we appreciate it, but I definitely wanted to say that it's necessary, the work you're doing, but I don't want the organizers to get lazy and think that it's just happenstance. There's also work behind you even being able to put that compassionate release, because first of all, there has to be a demand. So yeah, enough of my rambling, but go ahead.
No, yeah, I think you've captured the point perfectly, because without the impetus from the ground up, we wouldn't have gotten these changes in the law that create the platform to get this done. For the younger brothers and sisters who think that this is all ancient history and this is in the past, I just have two things to say. The first is to remind them of Dr. Frantz Fanon's observation that the most deadly weapon the colonizers have is colonization of your mind. If they can get you thinking that, they've won 2/3 of the battle already. So you cannot let yourself be hoodwinked there. The second is, look, I'm old, so I have a long view. I get it. But, there were hundreds of years where the divine right of kings was thought of as this immutable thing this is how the world works. And nobody even thinks of that as a concept of how government works anymore. Things will fall, but they don't fall unless we hit them relentlessly.
Definitely appreciate that. The words of wisdom. Love for you all to come back on. I have 118 more questions to ask. We're gonna let it be today, because I noticed both of you are pulling out the old card. Like, well, I'm old. We ain't got enough of that. Is though we don't acknowledge no movement dropouts, so we ain't having that.
All right.
appreciate the continuous fight on behalf of colonized people as a whole. And you know, let's keep in touch, and let's do it again real soon.
I'd love that.
Yes, and thanks so much for pulling this together, Kalonji. All your
Without a
other
doubt.
work.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Be safe. We'll talk to you soon. You're
Thank you.
checking out RSTV. That was Mark Kleiman and Claude Marks. And I think that I know some folks in the were saying that that they didn't get their notifications. Make sure you share this, because this is what they don't want you to hear. They don't want you to hear what's going on with our political prisoners. They don't want you to hear about what's going on with the workers behind the scenes. So it's necessary for us to continue to push the lever, to push the buttons, and to move forward. Um, we have a whole lot coming up again on Black Power Media. Stay tuned. We have a couple shows blasting off tonight, and also tomorrow we'll be dropping, starting with the morning show, and a whole lot of coverage and a whole lot of information coming through. So make sure you stay up on it. Black Power Media and RSTV. We out. Stay safe out there. Stay gangster.
Sometimes the riot is a quiet one, where the battle is to love yourself and function in society, where voices of reason are muted by anxiety, like gaining notoriety is selling your soul. So we tend to go no deeper than the shallow water level, trying to keep us overhead in the face of all the slurs and the stares. Mentally frozen, paralyzed by fear of failure and success. So we lock, stock, barrel, running while it's crumbling. All these towers and they're babbling, but the baby's in the bath and the stash under the bed on my head, spinning from the circles and the puppets and the strings that they pull. Then we move. Reactionary warfare never produces winners on the field. Feeble and foolish, what tools and what weapons are we using? We need some new ones. Real revolution, it's real solutions. What we've taken on the ways of the ones who conquer with their guns and religion and division. Got my inner me looking like my enemy. Real revolution, where my inner me really a mirror for the galaxy.